Hello and welcome to the latest installment of the United Synagogue's Torat Rabbi Sacks series. We're here today in Finchley Synagogue in London, better known as Kinloss, a place which Rabbi Sacks attended during his childhood and later in his youth as his family lived in this area, and which he taught at many, many times throughout his career. Our session today is part of the global Communities in Conversation project, which has been launched by the Rabbi Sacks Legacy Trust, and in particular is to commemorate his first yahrzeit, which with great sadness falls on the 20th of Cheshvan 5782 in the Jewish calendar, corresponding to the 26th of October 2021. And of course, our wishes of arichut yamim and of comfort go to all of the Sacks family. Please God, we will always be able to continue being inspired, and for future generations as well, by the Torah that Rabbi Sacks taught and everything which he accomplished and built. Now, our topic today, A Palace in Flames, represents what I think was one of his most foundational teachings, and one which had a tremendous impact on what he did as chief rabbi, but also in other elements of his life. And shortly, I'll attempt to demonstrate why by using one of his own source sheets, which he used to teach this particular topic. Now, first of all, I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you. Just a moment. And what we'll see here, as by way of introduction, is a short video about a book which was recently published by the United Synagogue, Rabbi Sacks and the Community We Built Together, written by members of his family and colleagues who worked with him, particularly during his tenure as chief rabbi. And within that book, and you'll even see within the short video, are a couple of points which are very significant to help us understand our topic of a palace in flames, which of course has an even greater question behind it, which is the question of why Abraham? Why was Abraham selected or became our founding patriarch? First of all, just enjoy this short film.
When Jews think of life, they think of a book. Books, the acts of reading and writing and studying and teaching and interpreting and expounding, all these things are absolutely fundamental to Judaism.
Now, there are two particular links to our topic in that book. The first is Rabbi Sacks' well-known essay, Why I Am a Jew, which we will return to later on, which is really the culmination of Radical Then, Radical Now, the book in which Rabbi Sacks first wrote about the palace on flames. So that will become significant for us later on. It's reproduced in the new book. The second is one of Rabbi Sacks' leadership principles, which here in this article is described by Rabbi Nicky Liss, my good friend and colleague, who studied for an MA in leadership and was mentored by Rabbi Sacks throughout that course. And in describing the principles of leadership, as Rabbi Sacks outlined to his rabbis at one of our conferences in the last year of his chief rabbinate, principle 1 at the bottom of the page reads as follows: leadership begins with taking responsibility. At the heart of Judaism are three beliefs about leadership. We are free, we are responsible, and together we can change the world. And these three principles will become very important, I think, in understanding the answers Rabbi Sacks suggests for us as to why Abraham. He also applied these, as you can see, to why Moses, a separate topic. Rabbi Liss gives the example here, when Moses left the comfort of Pharaoh's royal palace to say, when I see wrong, if no one else is prepared to act, I will. And of course, this is something in our spiritual DNA, so to speak, I'd suggest, from Abraham through to Moses. So I hope this helps to introduce our topic somewhat. Here's the front cover of the latest edition of Radical Then Radical Now, published in the United States by a different name as A Letter in the Scroll, but just to show you if you're looking for this book. And you'll find, as I said, other elements of this description of this topic in a number of Rabbi Sacks's other writings, in his Covenant and Conversation, in One People, for example. These ideas are expressed there. But what I want to do with you today is to show you his source sheet from, to the best of my knowledge at least, the last time that he taught this publicly, which was in New York University in the Bronfman Center. You can see it was just over 3 years ago, Shabbat Lech Lecha in 5778, that's 2018, where rather than just writing up his ideas, he went through the sources with the people in the audience, some in Hebrew, some in English. Today we will use the English ones, as that's how he organized the majority of this source sheet. And in doing so, we'll try and uncover how we see Jewish sources, old Jewish sources, grappling with the question of why Abraham. And let me give you a little bit of context first. The Torah is a book which has many disciplines in it. It has law, it has history, it has geography, but it's not about any of those by themselves. Instead, the Torah is a religious work, a divine work given to us by God, with important messages about how to live our lives. And the rabbis, particularly the Midrashic period, let's say roughly around the time of the Talmud, but also with lessons which went much earlier than that, even some going back to Sinai, the rabbis wanted to look at the words of the Torah and not just explain how to translate them, but what actually those messages should be for us, how to apply them in each generation, and to give us a system for doing so, understanding the wisdom of previous generations and how we can live that wisdom in our time as well. This is one of the critical applications of Midrash, particularly Midrash, which is trying to describe parts of the Torah which are not necessarily legally based. And particularly the stories of Abraham are in that category. So the Midrash, therefore, becomes a very important tool in understanding how we should live as Jews. And one of the most famous Midrashim, not a part of the Torah, but a Midrash, I say famous because it is for me, but I think almost everybody else that I've known, particularly who's been educated, I suppose, in the same context that I have, is a Midrash about how Abraham's father was an idolater. And as an idolater, he was selling idols. And what was Abraham going to do? Okay, of course, the story is famous. We will go through it, but Rabbi Sacks' translation shortly. In Radical Then Radical Now, Rabbi Sacks introduces this source by saying that tradition offers several explanations of how the journey of Abraham and Sarah to an unknown destination began. Again, our question of why Abraham. We know very little about Abraham from the Torah. We know he is born. We know he has a father called Terach. We know that that's the end of the parasha of Noah. We know in Lech Lecha, the next portion, he goes to the lands of Canaan. It turns out to be the lands of Canaan. He doesn't know where he's going originally when God sends him. The stories of Lot, the 5 kings against the 4 kings, of Ishmael. Then the story in Vayera of the account of him meeting the angels and having the challenge of Sodom and Amorah, the binding of Isaac, all of these things which were told about Abraham, but it's not clear from the beginning, from the text of the Torah, why Abraham was chosen. How was he the special one, so to speak? So Rabbi Sacks says, according to one of these explanations, Abraham was the Iconoclast who broke his father's idols. And that's what this story of the idols, so familiar, comes to teach us. The question it's really beginning to answer is, why Abraham? And before we answer it, let's also bear in mind another framework, which Rabbi Sacks taught and I found very powerful, not just for myself, but in my own teaching as well. 7 principles of maintaining Jewish peoplehood. Number 1, keep talking. Number 2, keep listening. Listen to others as well. Okay? And try and understand what they are saying. Number 4, don't seek victory. Instead, Rabbi Sacks taught us, seek truth, drawing on an amazing teaching of the Meiri, one of the great medieval scholars. Rabbi Sacks said that particularly when people are studying something together, but I imagine in many other contexts as well, don't seek victory, seek truth instead. Show each other respect, care, even when you don't agree. Remember that God chose all of us to be one people together. Very important principles, and I think we will see certainly some of them deriving from the example of Abraham, as we will study. Now here is this Midrash about Abraham and the idols. And as you can see, it's from Bereshit Rabbah, chapter 38, And it was said in the name of Rabbi Chia, the grandson of Rabbi Ada of Jaffa, which dates it probably in the 2nd or 3rd centuries CE. That's when this discussion was taking place. And imagine that Rabbi Chia was in shul. He was in a synagogue, probably not like this, but not so unlike this in certain ways. And he was addressing the question of why Abraham. People say, we don't understand why Abraham became Abraham. He became the first of the patriarchs. The Torah is not telling us explicitly why. Can you help us, Rabbi Chia? Rabbi Chia says, I'm going to tell you something about Abraham. Terach, his father, Abraham's father, was a worshipper of idols. Already, this is the context that Abraham grew up in. Not a great way to start a monotheistic life. One time, Terach had to travel to a place and he left Abraham in charge of the shop. When a man would come in to buy idols, Abraham would ask, how old are you? They would reply, 50 or 60. It would seem from here that Abraham was probably younger than them, given the question he is asking. But maybe not. That's just my supposition of this. Abraham would then respond, woe to him who is 60 years old and worships something made today. Oi, the customer would be embarrassed to would leave. Now just pause and again, put yourself in character, which one should try and do with all such stories. Abraham is meant to be minding the shop. He's meant to have the right sales pattern. He's probably got targets to hit. And someone comes in, they want to buy something. It should be an easy sell. Instead, Abraham asks them a question, a little bit personal. How old are you? They reply, 50 or 60. They don't give an exact reply. We'll see what's going on here, perhaps. Abraham would say, you're that old and you still worship idols? Okay, something made today? Haven't you thought about things in your life? And this age of 50 or 60 will become relevant later on in our presentation. Just bear it in mind. The customer would be embarrassed, presumably not personally embarrassed per se, but gosh, I hadn't thought of that, and would leave. And perhaps the import of this is perhaps even leave idolatry in some way. Gosh, that makes sense, Abraham. You're right. But when Terach gets back, Abraham will, of course, have to face the music. But this is nothing compared to, of course, what is about to happen. A woman entered carrying a dish full of flour. She said to him, this is for you. Offer it before them. She's challenging Abraham to worship the idol. Maybe she heard about what happened to the previous custom. So Abraham here doesn't say anything. Instead, actions will talk louder than words. He takes a club in his hands and broke all of the idols. It's one thing to try and out-argue someone. It's another thing to smash up all of the idols. You can't clear those up so easily. And place the club in the hands of the biggest idol, the only one he left still sitting. Now, the woman's response is not recorded, but Terach comes home and think of the scene which greets him, which Abraham must have anticipated. Terach returns, probably said oivei, the equivalent of, and asked, who did all of this? You can almost hear the weight of the question kind of weighing down as it's being asked. Abraham replied, and he's very tactically astute here, the way he's going to speak to his father. A battle again for truth, not for victory. I can't hide it from you. A woman came carrying a dish of flour and told me to offer it before them. So far, that's what happened. I did, though, says Abraham at this point, changing the story. And one of them said, I will eat it first. Another said, I will eat it first. The biggest one rose, took a club and smashed the rest of them. Terach, we could add in, probably looked at Abraham with incredulity and said, what? Do you think you can trick me? They don't have any cognition. Aha, can you imagine Abraham saying? Do your ears hear what your mouth is saying? You're the guy that runs the idol shop. And you're the one who's now saying these idols have no cognition. Ergo, what's the point of being able to worship them? Abraham, as Rabbi Sacks says, as the iconoclast, he's not prepared to accept false truths of an era or of an age that he lives in. Instead, he will pursue the truth. Now, we might have hoped that Terach would be persuaded by this, but Terach, at least at this stage, is not. And the continuation of the Midrash, which is just noted here but not quoted in full, is an uncomfortable, disturbing one. Terach took Abraham to Nimrod, the king at the time, great warrior king. Nimrod wanted to kill Abraham. God performed miracles to save Abraham. Of course, this makes us think also of a biblical story in the book of Daniel, when there were also miracles performed by God to save people that stood up for God, for monotheism against idolatry, at the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. But Abraham survives, as the Midrash says, and maybe this is the first answer to why Abraham. You can imagine Rabbi Chia bar Ada saying, gosh, Abraham was evidently a very special person. For God to speak to you, to make you a prophet, to say, Lech Lecha, you will go. You've got to be special. And perhaps this is about as special as you can get in terms of being impressive. Right? You stood up for what God meant in a world that didn't understand God. You were the one who was prepared to make good and to pursue truth, even when bad is all around you. Okay? And this will become very significant for us shortly. So this is the first source, and this is how Rabbi Sacks translated, and I've given you some elements of how he explained this Midrash. Again, you'll find it in greater detail in A Palace in Flames, in Radical Then Radical Now, and some of his other writings, but this is, I imagine if he was teaching it with us now, how he would be explaining it. And a meme here just sums up one of the messages. When we restore the social covenant, we defeat the politics of anger and recreate the politics of hope. Imagine if Terach had somehow defeated the politics of his anger, which I suppose was one of the drivers to send Abraham to Nimrod. Instead, be it someone who creates politics of hope. Actually, we can create something better, something genuine, and something authentic. Now, the second source that Rabbi Sacks brought is from Maimonides. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, better known as the Rambam, that's his acronym in Hebrew, one of our greatest figures, not just of the medieval period in which he lived, but also of all of Jewish history. And in his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah, a legal work, the Rambam has a section about laws of idolatry, not how to be an idolater, but how to relate to idolatry and avoid it. And what is idolatry? And he introduces it by talking about the history of idolatry. In the first part of the section, we're not quoted on our screen, but I'll just give it to you by way of introduction. He notes that after the time of Adam and Eve, humans, even amongst the best of them, made a mistake. They thought that since God had created celestial beings and the celestial beings served God, they were doing work of God, so to speak, that therefore it was worthy to worship those celestial beings at all. And this, of course, became idolatry. And the Rambam, picking up on this, continues and says, the world continues in this fashion until that pillar of the world, the patriarch Abraham, was born. Amazing. The world only changed when Abraham was born. Already at birth, there was something epoch-making about Abraham. After Abraham was weaned, while still an infant, his mind began to reflect. Remember, this is Abraham who before had been the Iconoclast. This is part of his makeup as well. Abraham ha'ivri, as the Torah tells him, not just from the other side of the river, of the Euphrates, as opposed to where he was in the land of Canaan at the time, but also someone who swam against the tide, so to speak. By day and night, as a child, Abraham wondered, how is it possible that the celestial sphere should continuously be guiding the world and have no one to guide it and cause it to turn round? For it cannot be that it turns round in and of itself. Abraham, the philosopher, as Rabbi Sacks explained to him, already at a young age. And you can see an amazing link, I think, to the Rambam, Maimonides, one of our greatest philosophers. Okay? And the significance of philosophy and a philosopher in religious experience. Abraham had no teacher, no one to instruct him in anything. He was submerged in Ur of the Chaldees, that's where his hometown was, Iran or possibly Iraq today, amongst foolish idolaters. His mother and father and the entire population worshipped idols, and he worshipped with them. It wasn't that he was sitting in a nice shul like this, a nice synagogue like this, in a nice Jewish community. He was in the midst of idolaters. He was even worshiping because that's what he brought up to do. But somewhere in his mind, no, this doesn't make sense. This is wrong. It can't be true. And it's not even as if with these idols that have no cognition of anything, you just say, this is God, it's beyond me. There's some things I can't understand. These were idols. His mind was busily working and reflecting until he had attained the way of truth, apprehended the correct way of thought, and knew that there is one God, that he, God, guides the celestial spheres, created everything, and that among all that exists, there is no God besides him. So Abraham here, the philosopher, this is the second answer to why Abraham was chosen to be Abraham, why he became Abraham, our founding patriarch, because he had philosophized and thought, and this brought him to a cognition of God in a way that presumably nobody else in his time had, and this laid the way, paved the way for him to become Abraham, who would follow the call of God and become the great Abraham that we know. Abraham realized, third line up from the bottom, that men everywhere were in error. I mean, really going against the stream, against the tide. And what had occasioned their error was they worshipped the stars and the images, so that the truth perished from their minds. And Abraham was 40 years old when he recognized his creator. Incredible. Okay, now, this might shed some light on what we saw in the first source about the customers saying they were 50 or 60, and Abraham was younger than them. But this was not a click your fingers moment from Abraham. 40 years old, having started thinking about this from the time he was an infant, finally, he recognized he had cognizance of God. So this is the second answer which we can suggest for why Abraham. It was a slow burn. It's a process that took time, but ultimately he recognized God. He came to this philosophical understanding, and this is one of the suggestions for why Abraham became Abraham. And again, looking in the Torah and thinking about analyzing what we are told of Abraham's life, how he thought through some of the very difficult things that he had to experience, be the Akedah, be it the problems with Lot, be it the problems with Sodom and Amorah. You can think about how to apply the Rambam's teaching here as to how this helped Abraham become a prime religious guide for us in the way that he dealt with these very, very difficult questions which we hope and pray we will never have to deal with. And another meme, I think, helps us transition from this source into the next. Optimism is the belief that things will get better, but hope is the belief that together we can make things better. And of course, Abraham, in the second source, is described as being by himself. We know from other Midrashim that he and Sarah certainly influenced many other people who went along with them, but that's not what we've seen in the sources that we are taught about, we are looking at this particular point. So how would Abraham potentially do that? Here's the Hebrew source Rabbi Sacks brought, a very famous one, and really I think the most significant for our presentation today, but we'll look at it in the English. And this is where the palace in flames, the title of our session, comes up. And in his chapter, which of course is called Palace in Flames, in Radical Then, Radical Now, Rabbi Sacks writes about this at some length. I was also fortunate to hear, it was about 3 weeks or so after his passing, the thoughts of his younger daughter Gila about this particular part of her father's writings, which she said was one of the favorite things which she had read in her father because it helped her consider some of our most difficult questions. It was at a session, a tribe youth session organized by our youth directors, our wonderful youth directors here in Finchley Synagogue by Leora and Harry Salter, and engaged with a significant number of teenagers to try and think about the legacy of Rabbi Sacks. And we remain grateful to Gila for sharing her thoughts then and for telling us why this was so, particularly in her experience as a family member of Rabbi Sacks, such a significant part of his writing. It wasn't just for people that learned from Rabbi Sacks externally, it was also in that context as well. Let's read it first in Rabbi Sacks's translation and see what we can do with it. So as usual, a Midrash, particularly Midrash Agadah, the kind of Midrash we're looking at, works off a source, a verse from the Tanakh, from the Bible. And this is the beginning of Bereshit, chapter 12, the beginning of Lech Lecha, last week's parashah. The Lord said to Avram, Lech Lecha, leave your land, your birthplace, and your father's house. So, to what may this be compared, says the Midrash? Why is Avram having this command to go to a place where he doesn't even know where he's going, but he's being told he has to leave? To a man who was traveling from place to place when he saw a palace in flames. And of course, this story the Midrash is telling is there is a nimshal, there is a comparison between not just what's mentioned in the story, but what the story is representing. We have to get that nimshal. He wondered, is it possible that the palace lacks an owner? The palace is on fire. If it's on fire, you'd expect the owner to put the flames out. The owner of the palace looked out and said, I am the owner of the palace. Now, this is very, very strange. First of all, the owner of the palace is unidentified, at least at this point. But if he's the owner of the palace, why is he standing there and not putting out the flames, or at least not shouting, help, help, the flames need to be put out? So Abraham, and bear in mind all we've learned about Abraham so far, Abraham, our father, said, he asked a question, is it possible that the world lacks a ruler? The Holy One, blessed be he, now identifying himself as the owner of the palace, looked out and said to him, I am the ruler, the sovereign of the universe. And Gila, in explaining her father's thoughts here and amplifying what Rabbi Sacks wrote in Radical Then, Radical Now, sees there are 3 elements to understanding this midrash. Maybe, and can be understood to say that, that there is just God in the world and there is no evil. You know, that the owner of the palace is God and there are just flames. As Rabbi Sacks puts it this way, the first view says that there is a world of order and disorder, that there are contending forces and chance and necessity. There is no palace, there is only flames. Okay? Sorry, I've said it the wrong way around before. There is no palace, there are only flames. The second view says, though, there is God, okay? And everything exists because he made it. But there are no flames. There can't be any evil which is represented by the flames. But the problem is with these explanations that there is a palace and there are flames. They are both in the Midrash, and of course there is God as well. So there has to be a third way. And Rabbi Sacks says, the faith of Abraham begins in the refusal to accept either of the previous two answers. For both contain a kind of truth, but also a contradiction. The first accepts the reality of evil, the second the reality of God. The first says that if evil exists, God does not exist. The second says, if God exists, evil does not. But what about if both exist, as the Midrash teaches us? And therefore, Rabbi Sacks said, and if he says, if I have interpreted the Midrash correctly, with great humility, he says that Judaism begins not in wonder that the world is, but in protest that the world is not as it ought to be. It is in that cry, that sacred discontent, that Abraham's journey begins. And Gila said that she understood this from her father as stating that Judaism is a protest against a world that isn't as it ought to be. And that we are given the possibility through the Torah that we are given and the opportunities of living that Torah to play our part in putting out the flames. The flames are there, and our job is to try and put them out. We don't understand why they are there. They are there for whatever reason, but we have to try and make sure that we are putting out those flames. And our question is the question. We don't have an answer, but the faith is found in a question. When things are as they ought to be, said Rabbi Sacks, then we have reached our destination. But that is not now. It was not now for Abraham, nor is it yet for us. A really powerful and important and significant idea in trying to understand all of the things which Rabbi Sacks taught us. And only man, said Rabbi Sacks, can put out the fire. But man is not alone. For God, the author of self-consciousness, is also the author of language. God speaks to man and tells him how to extinguish the flames. And that, of course, is through Torah. So, therefore, Rabbi Sacks concludes the chapter by saying Judaism is the revolutionary moment which humanity refuses to accept the world that is. And maybe that is ultimately the reason that Avraham was picked. Why Avraham? Yes, he was the Iconoclast. Yes, he was the philosopher, but also he was the person who refused to say, I'm not putting out the flames. And if you look at Abraham in the Torah, trying to look after his nephew Lot, trying to save Sodom and Amorah, complicated story nonetheless, but Abraham trying to save Sodom and Amorah, this is one of the most important lessons we learn from him. And that's not minimizing the questions. The questions can be very, very difficult. There's no doubt about it. But nonetheless, this is what we learn about Abraham and the palace on fire. We can't abandon the world to flames, and God is perhaps giving us an opportunity, as if it were, to try and put out the flames ourselves. Maybe that's why we are here with the Torah to guide us. And as Rabbi Sacks put it in another teaching, which is in this mean, faith does not mean certainty. It means the courage to live with uncertainty, which again is not easy, but it's something which as Jews we have done for many, many, many years. And one, I think, nice illustration of this, and particularly of his leadership principles, is this photo here. It's Rabbi Sacks together with John Humphreys, well-known BBC broadcaster, who for many years presented the Today program on Radio 4. Rabbi Sacks was a frequent guest there, giving the Thought for the Day slot, and I think at least one of, if not the favorite guest of John Humphreys. And despite their polar opposites in terms of faith, nonetheless, they can smile, they can communicate, and they can speak to each other and continue to talk and continue to try and put out the flames. And I think this is great testament to Rabbi Sacks that even someone like John Humphreys, as accomplished as he is, John Humphreys, but with a very different worldview to Rabbi Sacks, would be able to have this picture and both could refer warmly to each other in the way that they would discuss and debate matters. Before we close, with Why I Am a Jew, just two other things which you might be able to enjoy and look at. The first is this publication. It's called Little Books of Big Questions. It was published in 2007 while Rabbi Sacks was the chief rabbi. He wrote it for the Union of Jewish Students, and it contains some questions which remain big questions today. Being Jewish in the 21st century, Why the Jews and anti-Semitism? Judaism in a multi-faith society, Israel in search of peace, making a difference. And Rabbi Sacks refers this back to our questions of Abraham in his description on the back of this little pack, which the books came in. To be a student, he says, is to undertake a journey of discovery. To be a student in the early 21st century is a responsibility with all its challenges. It means writing the next chapter in the story of our people, a story 40 centuries ago that in the 20th century reached some of its greatest depths and greatest heights. He notes that as a student, he began his Jewish journey of discovery, and he hopes that these students will begin theirs. Our future, he says, depends on your involvement. Put out those flames. Get involved. You will gain even more than you give. And in a practical sense, in an article which was published 20 years ago in the Jewish Chronicle in London, for the edition of Parashat Vayera, this week's Torah portion, I don't have a great digital copy, it's not very clear, but I hope you can see at least the outline of the copy on the screen. Published really for this parasha 20 years ago, Rabbi Sacks wrote an article in advance of what was called the Kehillah Conference. It was a community conference for all of the synagogues, United Synagogue and elsewhere under his aegis, where he was trying to help them work more effectively together, explaining why team effort is better than bowling alone. And when rejecting the view of certain sociologists at the time that we should focus on an I rather than a we approach to life, Rabbi Sacks says Judaism does not mean going with society's flow, swimming with the tide. Whatever else Judaism is, it is not political correctness with a yarmulke. To be a Jew is to have the courage to be different, to swim against the currents, to challenge the idols of the age. Judaism cannot be translated into the language of radical individualism without losing its very essence. This is the fire of Abraham, but like Abraham and Sarah brought others with them, as Jews, we must bring others with us as well and build communities, as was very dear to Rabbi Sacks's heart. So thank you very much for joining us. And thank you that we can learn together for Rabbi Sacks's yahrzeit and participate in the Communities in Conversation project with so many others around the world. We'll close, particularly for those who haven't seen it, by just watching the Why I Am a Jew video, as I mentioned, first published in Radical Then Radical Now, and I think the apex of what Rabbi Sacks was trying to teach about the palace in flames and the other chapters in that book. I wish you well. Be'ezrat Hashem will be able to learn again soon.
Why I Am a Jew. The deepest question any of us can ask is, who am I? To answer it, we have to go deeper than where do I live or what do I do? The most fateful moment in my life came when I asked myself that question and knew the answer had to be, I am a Jew. This is why. I'm a Jew not because I believe that Judaism contains all there is of the human story. I admire other traditions and their contributions to the world. Nor am I a Jew because of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. What happens to me does not define who I am. Ours is a people of faith, not fate. Nor is it because I think that Jews are better than others, more intelligent, creative, generous, or successful. It's not Jews who are different, but Judaism. It's not so much what we are, but what we're called on to be. I'm a Jew because, being a child of my people, I have heard the call to add my chapter to its unfinished story. I'm a stage on its journey, a connecting link between the generations. The dreams and hopes of my ancestors live on in me, and I am the guardian of their trust, now and for the future. I'm a Jew because our ancestors were the first to see that the world is driven by a moral purpose, that reality isn't a ceaseless war of the elements to be worshipped as gods, nor history a battle in which might is right and power is to be appeased. The Judaic tradition shaped the moral civilization of the West, teaching for the first time that human life is sacred, that the individual may never be sacrificed for the mass, and that rich and poor, great and small, are all equal before God. I'm a Jew because I am the moral heir of those who stood at the foot of Mount Sinai and pledged themselves to live by these truths for all time. I'm the descendant of countless generations of ancestors who, though sorely tested and bitterly tried, remained faithful to that covenant when they might so easily have defected. I'm a Jew because of Shabbat, the world's greatest religious institution, a time in which there's no manipulation of nature or our fellow human beings, in which we come together in freedom and equality to create every week an anticipation of the Messianic age. I'm a Jew because our nation, though at times it suffered the deepest poverty, never gave up on its commitment to helping the poor or rescuing Jews from other lands or fighting for justice for the oppressed, and did so without self-congratulation, because it was a mitzvah, because a Jew could do no less. I'm a Jew because I cherish the Torah, knowing that God is to be found not just in natural forces, but in moral meanings, in words, texts, teachings, and commands, and because Jews, though they lacked all else, never ceased to value education as a sacred task, endowing the individual with dignity and depth. I'm a Jew because of our people's passionate faith in freedom, holding that each of us is a moral agent and that in this lies our unique dignity as human beings. And because Judaism never left its ideals at the level of lofty aspirations, but instead translated them into deeds which we call mitzvot, and a way which we call the halakha, and thus brought heaven down to earth. I am proud, simply, to be a Jew. I'm proud to be part of a people who, though scarred and traumatized, never lost their humor or their faith, their ability to laugh at present troubles and still believe in ultimate redemption, who saw human history as a journey and never stopped traveling and searching. I'm proud to be part of an age in which my people, ravaged by the worst crime ever to be committed against a people, responded by reviving a land, recovering their sovereignty, rescuing threatened Jews throughout the world, rebuilding Jerusalem, and proving themselves courageous in the pursuit of peace, no less than in defending themselves in war. I'm proud that our ancestors refused to be satisfied with premature consolations, and in answer to the question, has the Messiah come, always answered, not yet. I'm proud to belong to the people Israel, whose name means one who wrestles with God and with man and prevails. For though we have loved humanity, we have never stopped wrestling with it, challenging the idols of every age. And though we have loved God with an everlasting love, we've never stopped wrestling with Him, nor He with us. I admire other civilizations and traditions, and believe each has brought something special into the world. Aval zeh shalanu. But this is ours. This is my people, my heritage, my faith. In our uniqueness lies our universality. Through being what we alone are, we give to humanity what only we can give. This then is our story, our gift to the next generation. I received it from my parents and they from theirs, across great expanses of space and time. There's nothing quite like it. It changed and still challenges the moral imagination of humankind. I want to say to Jews around the world, take it, cherish it, learn to understand and to love it. Carry it, and it will carry you. And may you, in turn, pass it on to future generations. For you are a member of an eternal people, a letter in their scroll. Let their eternity live on in you.